All right. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition, thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Barbara Beckert with Disability Rights Wisconsin. DRW and the Wisconsin Board for People with Developmental Disabilities coordinate the coalition, and my co-lead Jenny Newgard and I will be moderating the briefing. We are recording the event, and we're also pleased to have Wisconsin Eye covering the briefing and recording it as well. We also have a resource packet that we hope will supplement the information we're covering today. And Jenny, if you could put the link to the resource packet in the chat, please. That would be great.
It's in there.
If you could add it again, sometimes if people are just joined, it may not appear for them. Thank you. So a little bit of background before the most important part of our program this morning, hearing from voters. The Disability Vote Coalition provides education and assistance to individuals with disabilities to promote their full participation in the electoral process. In addition, Disability Rights Wisconsin has a voter hotline, which assists voters with disabilities and older adults and other callers. So the concerns that you'll hear from us today are based in our experience of assisting thousands of voters over the years. The disability vote includes a diverse group of voters, people who are blind and low vision, deaf and hard of hearing, with intellectual and developmental disabilities, physical disabilities, mental health disabilities, complex medical needs, and chronic health conditions. Many older adults have disabilities acquired through aging, although they may not formally identify as a person with a disability. Yesterday, Wisconsin senators voted to advance Senate Bills 203 and 212, two bills which we believe will make it harder for many voters with disabilities, older adults, and other voters to absentee vote. These are among a number of bills introduced in February that would put in place new barriers and restrictions that would make it harder to vote for many of the voters that we assist. Voters with disabilities have a higher utilization of absentee voting because so many experience barriers to voting in person. Many are non-drivers with limited access to transportation, especially accessible transportation. In addition, polling place accessibility issues and/or disability-related or health concerns may limit their ability to vote in person. Instead of advancing new restrictions, we would welcome the opportunity to work with policymakers to ensure that our elections are more accessible and inclusive of voters of all abilities. And we have some proposals to help advance that goal. So I'm going to briefly give a few highlights of the two bills we're concerned about, and then turn it over to Jenny, who will moderate the discussion with voters. So SB 203, one of the bills that advanced yesterday, would limit options to obtain and return absentee ballots. We're really concerned about this because so many absentee voters are non-drivers, and they may rely on friends, neighbors, extended families, or others to deliver their absentee ballot to the clerk or a secure drop box. The mail has become increasingly unreliable, so people want to make sure that their vote counts and that it gets delivered in time. These new restrictions are going to be tremendously confusing. If voters have immediate family in the state, they can't have anyone else assist them, even if their family lives hours away or refuses to help. Many voters rely on care workers to return their ballots. SB 203 would not allow a person who delivers a ballot to be compensated. There are severe penalties. It could be a Class 1 felony to return a ballot for a friend or neighbor. People are going to be scared to help others. Finally, voters should have the freedom to choose the person that they trust to return their absentee ballot, not have it dictated by government. We're also very concerned about SB 212, which would forbid clerks from correcting minor defects on completed absentee ballot certificate envelopes. We know from our experience helping hundreds of voters that completing those absentee ballot certificates can be confusing. Very small print, not good in terms of accessibility. We're concerned that a lot of voters may not have their vote counted and may be disenfranchised if clerks don't have the ability to correct these minor defects. And if instead they have to mail the ballot back to the voter and allow time for the voter to receive and return the ballot. Posting a notification on My Vote will leave behind many of the voters we assist who do not have access to the internet or devices to access it with. So those are some of the highlights. The bills you're going to be hearing most importantly from voters whose lives may be impacted by those bills. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Jenny Newgart, to walk us through the next steps in the briefing. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Barbara. That was a great overview of what we're talking about today. And you're going to be able to hear from voters today about some of the personal concerns about these bills that are advancing in the legislature and how that will make voting more difficult. So I just wanted to point out that Wisconsin already has a significant disability gap. So Rutgers University puts out a great study on elections, and they have a fact sheet that you will find a link to that shows a 10.4% gap in Wisconsin voter turnout between citizens with and without disabilities. So that's a pretty significant number of people, and it's actually higher than the national average, which is between 6 and 7% gap. So the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition, we really want to work with policymakers to advance policies that will make our elections more accessible and inclusive of voters with disabilities. And we're afraid that these bills are really moving us in the opposite direction, and they will increase that gap. So we're going to dive into these fabulous speakers that we have. They're well-known advocates in the disability community who will talk about their personal experience, how these bills could affect their ability to vote. So first up is Steph Birmingham. She is from Sturgeon Bay, and she is passionate about disability rights. So Steph, let's hear about your perspective on these bills.
Good morning, Jenny. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share my thoughts and perspectives on these two bills that ultimately are essentially creating undue burden and barriers that quite simply are ableist and ultimately paternalistic. While perhaps put together in what are thought to be well-intended, ultimately really are creating unnecessary challenges to individuals like myself. If you were to see all of who I am, you would be seeing a 33-year-old white woman, short-statured, using a power wheelchair. But what you can't see and what you don't know is my reality of being a non-driver. And that I have a bone condition, and that I vote absentee. And that is a way that I am able to participate in our democratic process. And these bills that have unfortunately been passed are true limits and barriers to my fundamental civil right. The Senate Bill 203 that has been passed, limiting who can return a ballot really makes a lot of assumptions about people with disabilities. And it assumes that there are family members just sort of waiting around to help people with disability. And that really isn't always the case. And there's an assumption that people with disabilities have good relationships with their family, if they even do have family around. And to limit or to make it a crime for anyone else to return an absentee ballot is just silly. And and there seems to be this sort of assumption that somehow family are safer than anyone else. But we know that the National Council on Aging estimates that in almost 60% of elder abuse and neglect cases, the perpetrator is actually a family member. So there's sort of this false idea that family is somehow safer than anybody else, and that's not always the case. So having family be the person who's returning a ballot is sort of this false idea that it's a fail-safe method to prevent this supposed fraud. Um, there's this idea that people with disabilities somehow have their whole life perfectly planned out. And, a person might have somebody else designated, but life happens and things change. And what happens when that other person or that family member that maybe they were able to find changes? Life happens, things change. So now all of a sudden, should that person have to sort of forfeit their right to vote? That I don't think so. I don't think that their right to vote should also just disappear because um, they can't have somebody else return their ballot. Absentee voting and voting as indefinitely confined is so critical. For myself, in the spring 2019 election, at that time I didn't vote absentee, and I wish I had, because the experience of getting to my polling place was dangerous. I used a wheelchair. The sidewalks were not cleared of snow and ice, and there wasn't even sidewalk all the way to my polling place. So I had to drive my wheelchair down the middle of the road. I went sort of the after work hours, so it was dark. And I just sort of kept my fingers crossed and was hopeful that no car would hit me on my way to and from the polling place. But to me, it was that important to vote, that I was willing to risk my life. But I recognize not everybody is even able to do that. So to have these bills being passed that just complicate and add more and more barriers to an already difficult process, it is ultimately ableist and fails to recognize the privilege that is inherent in the lives of these authors of the bills. So I really implore those who support these bills and who are have the power to slow things down when it comes to passing these types of legislation, to really ask themselves the unintended consequences, and to check their own privilege, because ultimately they're harming a very large minority. The largest disability community is the largest minority in the United States, and we're growing. And disenfranchisement is absolutely uncalled for. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. That really made it personal and brought it to life, how it's going to affect people. So next we're going to hear from Andy Thane from Thorpe, Wisconsin. Andy's going to share his perspective as a voter from a rural area of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Stephanie, for those comments. Like Jenny said, my name is Andy Thane. I live in Thorpe, Wisconsin, which is about as small of a small town that you can get. And my voting experience actually has been different in every election that I voted in since I was 18. When I was 18, I was in a college situation where the voting was relatively accessible because it was like literally right on campus. Then when I moved back home, things changed again. Sometimes my employment situation has shifted where I'm relying on coworkers to take me to the polling place, or caregivers, or it's just kind of a grab bag of whoever's available at the time. And one of the things that is really concerning to me about these bills is the fact that, as Stephanie had said, it really dictates that the people that can help you with your absentee ballot are the folks that are your family members. And I live with my parents, but they're dairy farmers, and so their schedule is full. And so I really try hard to make a plan that doesn't involve voting when they do, because I don't really know when that's going to happen. They just kind of do it when they can. And so a lot of what I've had to focus on when I go to vote is, can I fit it into a work schedule, or can I fit it into a caregiver's schedule? And who do I trust? Who's that person that I know well enough that, you know, I can vote in private and they'll respect that without, you know, and still be willing to help. Not all the caregivers that I have worked with me have built that level of trust with me. Not to get off topic, but there's a lot of turnover in the in-home care space. And so, you know, I very rarely have the same staff member, you know, from election to election because of the high turnover. So sometimes that's a friend that helps. Sometimes that's a family member that helps. And sometimes it has been paid staff. And other times it's people from our church, or literally whatever I can work out. So if you layer on top of the challenges around making this plan to go vote, if you layer possible felony convictions or felony charges on top of that, that's going to dramatically reduce my options and make it more difficult to vote. And I honestly don't know if I will continue to vote absentee or if I will go to the polling place. A lot of that is going to depend on all those factors that I've already mentioned. And in order for it to work, I need as much flexibility as I can get. And this seems to be targeted at removing that flexibility. So that concerns me. And that's why I'm here today to just share with you that there are real repercussions to these types of legislative efforts. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Andy. That was very insightful. We appreciate those comments. We are going to move on now to Ramsey Lee. Ramsey is from Hudson, and he's been a tireless advocate. He's done a lot of work around voting rights. So Ramsey, curious to hear what you have to say about these bills.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you, members of the media, for being here. As Jenny said, my name is Ramsey Lee, and I'm from Hudson, Wisconsin, and voting bill, these voting bills would be very restrictive to people with disabilities and the elderly, because we have a large population of non-drivers, and it would restrict who could help people out, and we shouldn't restrict people from helping people. For me, my parents helped me, but what happens what happens if something happens to them? They're getting older, like we are, and if something happens to them, then my ability to vote will be greatly impacted. But this isn't about me. This is about Wisconsin citizens and making sure that they have can participate fully in the voting process. I'm not just doing this for me, but mainly the elderly population that might not have family in the area. I have a friend that lives in Madison, and she doesn't have family in the area, and under the current bill, only one person would be allowed to drop off bills. So even the voter ID coalition couldn't help her. I know we have aging population. We should be encouraging people to vote and not discouraging people. I know there was a story on the news of a person that went to the polls in the Winter in Milwaukee. That's how dedicated these voters are. And imagine how you would feel if a person told you you could have this person drop off your ballot, or you had to go to the doctor to get a note to vote. This could prevent a lot of hurdles for good people helping good people, especially the county clerks, because under current law, if something's missing, they can throw it in, and a lot of people have visual impairments and make it harder to read the ballot. So this would greatly restrict the election officials. So let's Wisconsin moving forward and focus on what really matters, and that is helping people so we can be a better nation because of it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ramsey. That was great. And Ramsey had shared with us too that his parents often help their elderly neighbors. So this law would say if they're helping Ramsey, they can't also help those neighbors who kind of have relied on Ramsey's parents to help them get their absentee ballots returned. So I like that connection, Ramsey, between people with disabilities and the aging population. Both groups will be impacted. So that brings us to our last speaker, but certainly not least. Melanie Ramey is from Madison, and she's going to share how the bills impact her as a person with a different disability than the other speakers you've heard from. So go ahead, Melanie.
Yes, thank you very much. I would begin by saying that I view these two abominable bills, SB 203 and SB 212, through the lens of a senior citizen with a visual disability and no family. I would suggest that the person who drafted these bills should perhaps go back to drafting class, because in their attempt to disenfranchise voters, they have produced two virtually nonsensical bills. For example, I have no family, and the bill says that I must, in writing, invite somebody to return my ballot. Now, what's supposed to be done with this letter I write? And the person I write it to, asking to return my ballot, what are they supposed to do with it? You know, and then it says that a person can only return the ballot of one non-family member. Is that person supposed to write some sort of statement saying that this is the only one they're returning? What's to happen to all of these statements and writings that everybody's supposed to do? Are they supposed to be handled by the municipal clerks? Are people supposed to go into the municipal clerk, have voter ID showing who they are, and that they're signing a statement they're only returning a ballot of one person? This puts an undue burden on municipal clerks at a time that they are already overburdened when an election is in process. And besides that, it doesn't even say it's a municipal clerk or anybody in particular who's supposed to handle all of these statements. And it's almost as bad if one has a family, you see, because you're required by these bills to use your family. Now, for example, if I live in Madison, and if I had a family that lived in Ashland, are they supposed to take a 10-hour round trip to Madison to take my ballot into the Madison Municipal Clerk's office? What if they refuse to do it? What if they're unwilling to do this? What if they're unable to do this? Are they to be punished in some way? For example, in this first instance I used for the person returning the ballot for me, only one non-family member, if they are in violation of these laws, they are subject to a class 1 felony. Now, what is a class 1 felony? Well, given the punitive nature of these bills, it's probably life imprisonment. And so let's look again at the municipal clerk, the great burden this might place on the municipal clerk. In the past, the municipal clerks have had the ability that if a ballot comes in its envelope, and perhaps the witness signing on the envelope has left off their zip code, the municipal clerk could look up and add the zip code on. They can no longer do that under these bills. They, in fact, are subject to a $10,000 fine and 3 years imprisonment if they would do so. Now, the municipal clerk is a very, very busy office. And so, you know, what they're to do now under these bills is they're to put on the website, My Vote, that this ballot has come in and it has a deficiency. Well, if you don't have a computer or you don't have access in parts of the state to the internet very often, you don't even have access to my vote. So you don't know that there's been a problem with your ballot until it comes back to you in the mail. Now, by the time the mail gets it back to you, and you would be able to get it back in, you may have missed the deadline for voting. So could clearly disenfranchise you just over some minor issue. I have voted in every election since I was of legal age. And I've devoted most of my professional life to civil rights and social justice. I would remind the authors of these bills that many thousands of Americans have died in foreign lands to preserve our right to democracy. And democracy is predicated on the rights of the people to vote and to elect their government. This kind of legislation clearly does nothing to help keep democracy. In fact, the right to vote is enshrined in our Constitution. These sorts of bills undermine the very foundation of our country. I would also suggest to the authors of these bills that they quit wasting the taxpayers' money and time in trying to disenfranchise voters, but instead should conduct themselves in a way that they can produce bills that would enable people to vote more easily and to become registered to vote more easily. I would also suggest to the authors of these bills that someday they will become senior citizens, and they may have age-related disabilities, or they may be able to avoid them, but not all of their family members can. And perhaps tomorrow they would be in a car accident and end up in a wheelchair. How will they cope with these atrocious bills? How do members of their families, are they able to comply with these atrocious bills? I would also say that it behooves us as voters to take note of people who try to disenfranchise our right to vote. I think that we should take note of their names, and when they stand for election next time, that we should use our right to vote them out of office. They should be ashamed of themselves for trying to have bills and trying to pass legislation that seeks to disenfranchise some of Wisconsin's most vulnerable citizens.
Well, this is Barbara Beckert again. I want to thank each of our speakers, Melanie, Ramsey, Andy, and Steph, for sharing their concerns and their passion for the right to vote. This constitutional right is so important to our community members, including to voters with disabilities and older adults. And the new barriers and restrictions that these laws would put in place would imperil that right. We're going to open it up now. If there are any questions, we'd like to hear from you. You can put them in the chat or raise your hand and we will call on you. Our speakers are available.
Hi, this is Scott Bauer with the Associated Press. I don't have the raise hand function on here, sorry. I had two questions. I just wondered if each of the speakers or the moderator could describe how we should describe their disabilities, their individual disabilities. And also, Barbara, could you or maybe Jennifer just speak to the number of folks that are generally considered to be in the disabled community in Wisconsin? Thank you.
Scott, thank you for the question. Would any of our panel members like to respond to Scott's question in terms of describing the disability?
Sure, I'll
Stephanie?
go first. I have cerebral palsy. I've been in a power wheelchair since I was 3.
This is Stephanie. Scott, thank you for asking such an important question. Just sort of want to add to that question, just in response that I appreciate your acknowledgement that language does matter. So thank you for just not making an assumption about how to describe and just being wise and just asking the question of those of us who are speaking today. So thank you for that. I have a bone condition called I'll put it in the chat because it's kind of a mouthful, but osteogenesis imperfecta. And I would just, you can say I'm a disabled person who uses a wheelchair or is a wheelchair user. So thank you for asking that. And
Yeah.
in general, the stats waffle, at least nationwide, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5, but usually 1 in 4 is sort of the standard number. So about 25%, 26% of the US population are individuals with disabilities, and that's all types of disabilities. And that data, the reason it's 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 sort of depends on which data set you're using, whether it's the American Community Survey or whether you're using sort of some CDC data. But and part of that challenge is the way disability is defined. Without going on a whole long explanation, it's difficult. How disability is defined, there is, as you might find ironic, not one single definition that stands across all data sets. But the most sort of go-to definition would be out of the ADA, which sort of takes its roots out of the Rehab Act. But I would think nationwide, you're safe to say 1 in 4, so about 25% of the US population. For Wisconsin, you know, Barbara and Jennifer probably would have better data Wisconsin-wise.
Yeah, this is MVV. First of all, thank you for all your hard work with the Associated Press. I always enjoy reading what you have to say. And I have cerebral palsy. And the more the story is that oftentimes people like to help people, not only my parents, but everybody likes to help each other up because that's what we do as Americans. And there is a lot of people with disabilities in Hudson that are on low income, and they might not have transportation to the post, and transportation is already limited. So if people don't have family in the area, it can cause problems for you. And I just want to say thank you for your hard work at the Associated Press. I know a couple TV stations out here, so I appreciate everybody's hard work. Thank you.
Any other comments from our speakers?
Melanie, did you
Yes, I
want to
would
say?
like to comment too about my own disability. Is I have macular degeneration, which is age related, and it's also the fact that many more people will also have this disability and cannot drive. And I would also comment that people with diabetes often have visual impairments that prohibit them from driving. And all of these numbers are just going to increase because we have an aging population. So this even becomes more critical for people not able to drive, how they're supposed to cast their absentee ballots. So this is really a very serious issue.
Melanie and our other speakers, thank you so much for your comments. And I think your point about the aging population increasing in Wisconsin is such an important one. In terms of, Scott, your question about the number of voters with disabilities, I did put a response in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see that. The Election Commission recently published some data regarding the size of Wisconsin's voting age population, and of those 3,785, 290 people were registered to vote on April 1st. In terms of the percentage of those who have a disability, the American Association for People with Disabilities, AAPD, based on their research, estimates that 23% of the voting population are people with some type of a disability. And again, that's a wide spectrum. Some of those may be disabilities related to aging. And in Wisconsin, as Jenny mentioned, we do have a disability gap. There's some research from Rutgers University, which is included in your packet, and that shows that people with disabilities vote at a lower rate in Wisconsin than in other states. So it may be less than 23% in our state. And we feel that that's in part because our state has a very high number of restrictions related to voting, including one of the most restrictive photo ID laws in the country. And just a sneak preview, next week, the Disability Vote Coalition is going to be joining with other advocacy partners to release a report on the challenges related to obtaining photo ID through the Department of Motor Vehicles, and putting forward some recommendations to address those barriers. So that's one of the reasons why the indefinitely confined voter provision, among others, is especially important to Wisconsin voters with disabilities and older adults, because people may face formidable barriers to getting a photo ID due to their health status, not driving, lack of accessible transportation, and other reasons. Any other questions?
And Scott, if I could, I'm worried about people that may be in group homes that who could potentially face barriers to getting a dog because if you have 4 people, if you have 4 people in the group home under this law, only one person could drop off the person's dog, so it could create problems for people in group homes, you know what I mean?
Ramsey, thank you for that comment. That's a great point. So Ramsey, you noted that you're concerned that SB 203 could make it harder for people in group homes because there might be a staff person who would return everyone's absentee ballot for them. In addition to that, there's another bill, SB 205, which would restrict care providers in a care facility like a group home from assisting residents with voting. And we're very worried that that would have a chilling impact. Again, there's the threat of a felony. So even though there might be some limited ways in which the law would allow staff to assist, these low-wage workers already have a really tough situation. I think they're going to be frightened and intimidated by these bills, and they're going to feel that, they don't feel safe helping their residents with voting any longer. And as a result, I'm afraid that a lot of people will be disenfranchised, especially those who live in smaller care facilities. The large nursing homes may be more likely to have a special voting deputies come in and provide assistance. That doesn't happen as regularly in smaller care facilities where many people with disabilities live. Well, we've really appreciated the opportunity to talk with you today and for you to hear from voters at a time when such restrictive bills are advancing in our legislature that would impact the voting rights of so many Wisconsinites. We'll be here if anyone has additional questions. We're happy to entertain those. We hope that the resource packet we provided is helpful to you. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions and we can connect you with any of our speakers as well. We're so grateful to them for taking the time to share in such a personal way how these bills could restrict their ability to vote, plus your concern for other voters in our state who would be impacted. Finally, we want to work with legislators. We all see opportunities to improve the election system in Wisconsin. And we really want to work with policymakers to make sure our elections are not only secure, but accessible and inclusive of all voters. So thank you for everyone for joining us today. As I said, we'll be here if there are any additional questions.
This is Scott Bauer again. I'm going to jump in with one more. The governor has been pretty clear, I think, that, or the expectation is that if these bills would pass, he would veto them. Given that, why is it still important for you to talk out about these, given that it seems highly unlikely they're going to become law?
Yeah, Scott, thank you for that question. I think our goal is to ensure that legislators take another look at these bills and that they realize that there would be consequences that they might not have considered that would disenfranchise and make it harder to vote for many people with disabilities and older adults. We're looking at the long term here. We want to make sure that our legislators, regardless of their party affiliation, understand that this is going to impact voters in their district and that we think that they should reconsider their support for these bills and these extreme restrictions. As Melanie pointed out, disability is a group that any of us can join at any time. Aging related restrictions are, that's something that we all hope to reach that point in our life, that we all hope to become older adults, and any one of us may be impacted by it. So these provisions are really going to have such a broad impact. We really want to ask legislators to slow things down, take another look, and reconsider the direction that they're going in, and instead work with the disability and aging community on some of the options that we'd like to make forward. Make our polling places more accessible, make sure that laws are being followed. Curbside voting, for example, is the law in Wisconsin, but it's rarely offered. People don't know about it. Those are the types of inequities that we hope the policymakers will address, and we're ready and willing to work with them. Any other comments, Jenny?
Yeah, if I could piggyback on that. The other thing we're looking at in terms of the long game is we don't know what might happen in the next election for governor. We could end up with a Republican governor who would have passed those, and these could be brought up again. So our voices have to be heard about this to, as Barbara said, slow things down and make sure that they don't just pop up again and actually do get passed into law in the future. So that's why we're fighting so hard now.
I also think, to sort of build both on what Barbara and Jennifer have said, but the whole collection of all these voting bills that we have both talked about today and referred to that will be coming forward for future votes. really, to me, sort of are a representation of an ideology that is so pervasive in our society. And I've used the term ableism and paternalism, and I really truly believe they are ableist, uh, come from ableist values. And I don't necessarily think it's explicit or intentional, but I think it's unexamined ableism and unexamined paternalism. And I think speaking out about these bills, yes, it is about protecting voting rights, absolutely. And it's also saying, wait a minute, ableism cannot continue. And this is just another facet to highlight how ableism is pervasive. And ableism is this notion that able-bodied, right, is sort of the preferred way of operating. It's a model. It's sort of this. Uh, it's like any other ism, and for me, it's sort of, again, just calling out these attitudinal barriers that infuse themselves in systems and policies and institutional structures that have such detrimental, life-altering consequences for people with disabilities and older adults. And these bills just are one more example where we see it. And as a community, we're coming together and saying, wait a minute, this is not okay. Not only is this about our civil rights, but we know that if it can happen here, the fear is, where else can this happen? Where else might my life, my right become jeopardized? If my voting right can be jeopardized, what next? So yes, it's about the short game, right? But really, it is about the long game, and it's about the values and the honoring of the human dignity of people with disabilities and older adults. That's really what it's about. It's questioning and asking, is my life really that invaluable? Because if it is, we got a lot more work and education to do.
Yes, Scott, if I could just add to that, I recently testified at some hearings with the senators on elections, and one of the senators, I can't remember who it was, said that she has a daughter that's 17 years old, and she likes to help their neighbors drop off their dog for them because they might not have access to do it. Well, under this law, they would have to verify that the person that is dropping the dogs off is actually a valid Wisconsin voter. I understand why they're doing it, but it's gonna create more hurdles for not only our community but everybody, because how
Thank
is
you.
it
Oh,
before a person votes, they're gonna have to go on and make sure who's stopping the ballot officer found Wisconsin voter. So it can no longer be let this huge
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for making that point, Ramsey, about, younger people. You have to be a registered voter to help, so you can't help your neighbor anymore, if you're not a registered voter. So teenagers can't help out in that way. I see Jonathan has a hand up. I'm sorry, I missed that. Jonathan, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Don't worry about it. I just raised it like a minute ago, so
Oh.
don't worry. I was just wondering what what proposals could be put forward that would instead help people with disabilities vote, as opposed to kind of impeding the progress.
That is a great question. So I'll throw out a few, and then I see Steph nodding. So I think that she has some ideas. One thing that we have really worked on as a coalition is there are three areas that come to mind. One is the need for an accessible absentee ballot. Wisconsin currently does not have that. So people who use an accessible voting machine would like to be able to vote absentee privately and independently. So having an ADA compliant screen reader accessible absentee ballot, is so many states have added that option during COVID. Wisconsin is not keeping up. So that's an important option to provide equitable access for people who are blind, visually impaired, or for other reasons use assistive technology. In addition, improving access to the DMV. Wisconsin has among the most limited hours at DMVs in the country, limited locations. People do not have access to that. We'd like to see other opportunities for people to get photo ID. In some cases, maybe someone should come to the home to assist someone who otherwise cannot leave their home. That's why we have so many indefinitely confined voters without photo ID. Other ideas would be to place DMV photo ID access at aging and disability resource centers or other locations where people may be more easily able to access them. Also extending hours to Saturdays and more hours during the week. Some DMVs are just open for a few hours each week, and a lot of locations were closed during the pandemic. And the whole area of inaccessible polling places, that is a huge barrier in Wisconsin. Our agency does audits of polling places for the Election Commission, and we've personally seen many issues. So having more rigorous oversight of the requirement that polling places be ADA accessible and giving municipalities the funding they might need to address some of these issues and the supplies that they need to enforce curbside voting. Training as well. Poll workers have minimal training. Steph, I see you nodding. Do you want to chime in about the training?
Yeah, so my two sort of thoughts that came to mind with regard to that question were certainly the accessible absentee ballot, or just accessible ballot altogether, but particularly absentee ballot. And yes, the training aspect of it. I've voted, when I've voted in person in the past, I mean, I don't even know that there was an accessible voting machine. So I ended up voting on the corner of the table where you go to not register, but to sort of check in to vote. That I voted there. Now, I guess I'm not particularly concerned about privacy for my vote because that's just my personal, I don't really care. Who knows how I vote, because whatever. But now looking back, I'm like, well, that was sort of backwards that I voted on the corner of the table. Shouldn't have really happened that way. But training poll workers, like, hey, it's not really the best place to have somebody be voting. And if they need an alternate way to vote, you should have the accessible voting booth or stall, have it up, have it ready. It should be ready to rock and roll. There should be no, I shouldn't have to, go, geez, is that even available? Especially, when it's very apparent that the person coming in is a person with a disability. I'm using a wheelchair. It's pretty obvious. Now, when it comes to other disabilities where they're hidden, there's sort of understandably is a reluctance on behalf of just people in general to sort of ask, and that's appropriate. That reluctance is good. We shouldn't just start asking everybody, do you have a disability? Do you have a disability? However, it wouldn't be that difficult to just, let anybody coming through know, like, just so you know, if you're in need of an accessible voting booth, we have one available. Just let us know. So really just educating, again, to what Barbara said, educating poll workers, and things just, they're supposed to be for curbside voting signs that, make it clear and obvious that, you call this number or you're supposed to ring a bell and those sorts of things. But lots of times those things don't happen, or they're just not well thought through. And oftentimes it's just, sometimes if a person's not asking for it, it's assumed it's not needed. And unfortunately, that's not the best way to provide a service, to provide it only if someone asks. Well, people also aren't likely going to ask if they don't know if it's available. So it'd be best just to have it as a standard way of practice, because then it also saves the person with the disability who might need that accommodation. Not everybody is comfortable having to sort of be super vocal about asking for that sort of thing. Yes, that responsibility may be on them, yes, but to make some sort of dramatic announcement about it, not everyone is okay with having to do that, especially for those who have invisible disabilities. The disclosure that goes with that is different than the disclosure for someone like myself, where I don't have a choice of disclosing that I have a disability. It's very obvious. So it's just those things that I think aren't thought of when it comes to visible versus invisible disabilities, and there's sort of this unspoken sort of energy and planning and process that takes place for people with disabilities, because we have to be prepared to navigate in a world that is not created for us. And I don't say that from a standpoint of poor people with disabilities, but it's a reality. So honoring that reality and recognizing there are so many fantastic opportunities to just normalize the experience, so that it's not like, oh gee, when I get to my polling place, I'm not gonna be able to get the door open. Okay, I can't get the door open, so who am I gonna ask for help with? Well, if I just sort of jerry-rig my wheelchair through, I might be able to get through. Okay, is there an elevator to get upstairs? Okay, I have to figure out the elevator. There's all of this sort of mental gymnastics that can happen, and I think Ramsey spoke about that earlier, about, okay, right, finding who's gonna return the ballot, all of that. These are things that, by and large, those outside the disability community don't have to take into consideration. And that's good. That's a good thing. But why not do what we can to reduce that added energy that has to be exerted to do the things that everybody else gets to do? Anyway, yeah, I'll stop there.
I think, Stephanie, it speaks to my point that these are the kinds of things that the legislature should be concerned about, how to make it easier for people with disabilities to vote and everybody else. And so, this is not a pleasant experience when people go in and they have to beg, for the machine to vote by, when perhaps somebody has a bad attitude toward people with disabilities. I mean, these are very unpleasant kinds of situations for people to have to go through in order just to exercise a constitutional right. And I think these are the issues that the legislature should be spending its time and energy on, is trying to make it easier for everybody to vote and not to go around disenfranchising people. You know, in some ways, you look at these two bills are actually a form of government bullying. They have picked on some of the most vulnerable people to try to disenfranchise them in their right to vote. This is a form of bullying and it's absolutely unacceptable. And I think it's an abomination. And so the legislature should go back and read the bills that they have been voting for and look at them in those lens, because this is exactly what this comes down to. And if they choose this time the vulnerable people with disabilities to try to disenfranchise, who is the next group that they may decide to choose to try to deny the right to vote? This is a very serious matter, and these bills should not ever have been even introduced.
And if I could add to this, we are very lucky. We are very lucky to be in this wonderful state of Wisconsin. And one of my goals as a person is to help improve the quality of life for people of all abilities. For example, when we passed a voting bill a couple years ago, that was 148. That was in response to a person in Milwaukee in the Milwaukee area that couldn't speak their name and address. It is my goal to love one another, and a lot of people that are in group homes may not be comfortable getting their mail there because who knows if the mail actually gets to the person. And if I could just put a plug in here, Wisconsin has a wonderful Partners in Policy program that teaches people how to be great advocates for themselves. And I can't thank them enough, and I would encourage everybody to look into that program, because that has changed my life, and that has made me an even more give me a stronger desire to be a better advocate. And my question to each of you are, what can we do to help you as is there any ways that we can help you? Like at the Associated Press, is there any information that you want or any other news outlets? I don't often go to the media because I believe in talking to people, but how can we best help you?
Ramsey, I think you provided a lot of help for the media today with the information you've shared. And I wanted to especially thank you for mentioning the bill that you took a lead on passing in 2019 that addressed the requirement for voters to speak their name and address, which was causing some voters who have difficulty speaking, including voters who are deaf, to be disenfranchised. And that's an example of the type of thing that we'd like to do with our policymakers. That bill got 100% support from members of the Wisconsin Assembly and Senate. And, you know, and the leaders on that bill were Republicans, and including your representative, Representative Zimmerman, who did a great job moving it forward. So we would love to have other opportunities like that. Well, everyone's been so generous with their time. We appreciate the chance to have the additional dialogue and extend the briefing a bit longer than we anticipated. So thank you so much to the media for sticking with us. And feel you know how to reach us. Feel free to follow up with additional questions. And most of all, thank you, Ramsey, Melanie, Steph, and Andy for sharing your frontline perspective and expertise on how these bills would impact you and other voters. We're really grateful to you, and I've learned a lot from you as always.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, and you'll be able to catch this on Wisconsin Eye, and I will be also sharing our recording with John because he shared he had a little technical difficulty at the end. So I'm going to stop recording.